Evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Lisa Murray, and I'm the Assistant Director and Program Coordinator for the MDI Historical Society. I'm here with Jenn Booher, and during her talk, we welcome your questions. If you could post them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom window, we will collect them and answer them at the end of the program. And also at the end of the program, we'll open it up if people want to talk and ask questions as well. Before we start tonight's program, I want to invite you to join us for a couple of upcoming events. On Monday, February 23rd, we will be in person at the Woodlawn in Ellsworth, where our director, Rainey Bench, will share fascinating stories of Maine's historic storms and how these stories of survival equip us to prepare for current and future weather events. It's a fascinating program, and it's called Wicked Pissa, and she's done it before. And people keep asking her to do it again. So I highly recommend you go to that. I believe that is going to be in person only, but you might want to contact the Woodlawn. Then on Thursday, More Than Just a Recipe with Rachel Snell will be via Zoom here on February 26th. This is based on her 2025 Chebacco article. And she will discuss how 1920s and 30s community cookbooks served as vital records of women's social lives and community building efforts in rural Maine. And I posted a link to both of these in the chat. I posted them before we started the Zoom, so I hope they're still there. If they're not, I'll post them again. For those of you who are new to our work, we have been publishing our annual history journal, Chebacco, for 22 years, and it has evolved from a 98-page booklet in 2004 into a large format, full color, illustrated and bound journal that we have today. Since the beginning, each themed issue of Chebacco is filled with stories that look at oft-told tales from new angles, interpretations based on new sources or emerging pathways and subjects that explore the boundaries of the theme. Chebacco has won national and regional awards for excellence, and our articles are shared online through our website. In 2026, Chebacco's theme is Our Island Experiment, and it will explore local facets of the ongoing democratic journey on Mount Desert Island. It will be mailed to our members and available for purchase in April. It is in production right now, and it's going to be really good. I'm very excited about it. And in case you're wondering about our name, a chebacco is a type of boat that was built in the 18th century on which the island's first permanent European settlers, Abraham Soanes and his family, sailed up here in 1762. But tonight we are joined by Jennifer Booher, a Bar Harbor artist who has been a vital part of making Chebacco the stellar publication that it is today. Jenn uses still life photography, cyanotype, is that pronounced correctly? And drawing to explore the fascinating intersection of science and history. She was a resident artist with Acadia National Park for several years and has served as her own artist in residence since 2018. Jenn is the recipient of numerous honors, including 2 Maine Arts Commission project grants, a Frenchman's Bay Partners Environmental Stewardship Award, and a Kindling Fund award from the Space Gallery and the Warhol Foundation. She brings an incredible depth of knowledge to her craft, holding a BA in art history and Asian studies from Vassar College and a master's degree in landscape architecture and historic preservation from the University of Virginia. For our 2025 edition, The Art of Nourishment, Jenn created 12 photographs inspired by the 16th century Dutch still life tradition. Well, the project started with food. Jenn and our authors soon realized they were talking about many kinds of nourishment: the community of church suppers, the preserving of culture through recipes, and even the weight of cultural expectations. Jenn spent months sketching concepts, cooking historic recipes, and crowdsourcing props like neon signs and child-sized shopping carts. Her work in this edition bridges the gap between high art and the everyday, substituting modern materials like plastic bottles and aluminum for the silver and glass found in traditional Dutch paintings. Tonight, she is going to share the misadventures behind these images, from the challenge of photographing artifacts in museum basements to the creative use of a plastic lobster named Claudia. Please welcome Jenn Booher.
Thank you, Lisa. And I do have to clarify, you're going to hear about misadventures with pretty much everything. There was a lot of experimentation in this project, and frequently it turned out the answer to what happens if I do this is nothing good. This was supposed to be Swedish fish swimming in blue jello. Yeah. So I've been working with the MDI Historical Society since 2018. And when the director told me that the theme for 2025 would be food, I proposed a series of photos in the Dutch still life tradition, which I've been messing around with on a small scale for years and really wanted to dig into. I made 12 images for the 2025 Chebacco, and I'm going to show you 6 of them in detail. One more if we have time. First, a little bit about what I find so fascinating about this style. And sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Oh, shoot. I've just been told I'm not sharing my screen. Hold on. Are you seeing it now?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. All right. So that was the Jello failure. And here, a little bit about what I find so fascinating about this style. So still life became a popular genre in European painting in the late 16th century. Painters in other countries did work with the genre, but it developed so conspicuously and distinctively in the Baroque era Netherlands that this kind of dramatically lit assemblage of food is still referred to as the Dutch still life tradition. So one of the characteristics of the style is this hyper-realistic, sharp focus with an intense level of details. Like if this were a better reproduction, you would be able to count the seeds in that lemon. And the lighting is also distinctive, with bright highlights and dramatic shadows. The paintings are incredibly tactile. You can tell how smooth that silver pitcher would feel if you could touch it, the lumpiness of the lemon peel, and how wet and slippery those oysters are. But I'm also drawn in by the subject. In a lot of these paintings, the painters intended to evoke, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold and have a little bit of cough. The painters were trying to get at a kind of puritanical morality. They're riffing on death and mortality and the fleeting nature of earthly pleasure. And the symbolism is not subtle. The food is partially eaten, it's spilled across the table. It often looks like there's been a really boisterous party with totally obnoxious guests. And insects or mice sometimes nibble on the leftovers. This is one of my favorites, and there's a squirrel raiding the fruit basket on that table. In the most didactic of these, a skull might sit near an hourglass or a watch or some other symbol of time passing. But that moralizing is undercut by the objects that are used to show it. The paintings are studies in wealth and luxury and pride. The variety of objects reflects Dutch colonization and trade routes and features imported fruits, Chinese porcelain, Venetian glass, richly colored fabrics. Spirals of lemon peel were a common trope. And this is a time when citrus fruits were a really exotic luxury. So the irony of that gloomy moralizing paired with these really lush products of a hyper-capitalist society, I don't know, something about that really appeals to me. It's like, on the one hand, thou shalt not, and on the other hand, we're all going to die anyway, pour me another. And then there's also this sense of precarious unbalance. The dishes and wine glasses are not only knocked over, They are set down so close to the edge of things, it's like a matter of time before somebody's elbow sends that glass flying. And then knives and plates literally teeter on the edge of the table. So when I set up the concept, like the framework for this series, I tried to include 4 elements common to this genre in each of my own images: something silver, something glass, a lemon, and a mess. But I freely substituted, as Lisa mentioned, modern materials like tinfoil, aluminum, plastic bottles. And in one image, I used lemon head candies instead of an actual lemon. So I started work by drawing thumbnail studies of composition and lighting in paintings that I particularly liked, looking at things like where the eye level is. Like, are you looking down at the table or up at it? And what direction the light's coming from, whether you can see things in the shadows or if they're completely dark, and then trying to work out a composition and a lighting scheme that approximated that kind of effect. My daughter was away, so I took over her bedroom to build the studio. Her bed is literally turned on its edge and standing up behind that black velvet backdrop. And on the right, I did these studies with 4 wine glasses to figure out how far the light reached at different intensities. After this, I put black cloth over the windows and doors to eliminate light leaks. My family acted as collaborators, chefs, photo assistants, and food wranglers for many of these images. And we tried really hard to minimize food waste. Some things couldn't be saved, like after 4 or 5 hours under studio lights, a salami sandwich is just gross. But every time I finished a still life, we gathered 3 generations of our family to eat up whatever had survived. Then I started to gather props, because the thing about photography is that you need things to photograph. And knowing it would take months to pull all this together and that I would need very particular kinds of tableware and ingredients, I began sketching concepts and poking through friends' china cabinets immediately. Now, and if you're a friend of mine on social media, you remember me posting things like, does anyone have a neon open sign I could borrow? And of the 12 still life images I ended up making, only 3 were made entirely from things I already owned. So let's start with this one. This accompanied an article on the history of picnics on MDI, to which I responded with a photo of supplies for a summer hike up Door Mountain with my kids when they were little. I started with this Frederick Church painting of Eagle Lake, which the author discussed in the article. Fortunately, it's owned by the Smithsonian, and they provide high quality downloads of their holdings, so it was easy to work with, and copyright wasn't an issue. And I know, yeah, copyright, I can make an argument for fair use, but it's always simpler to avoid the need for an argument in the first place. So I keep copyright in mind when I do my work. And you can see I pulled colors out of the painting to start forming a palette for my own image. I made a large print of the painting to use as a background. I printed it on multiple sheets of paper and like taped them all together, and then decided to pull out the blues from the lake. And then I went rummaging through the house for supplies, and as you can see, piled everything up in front of the painting to see what I had. The studio I set up for this was on the 3rd floor. So I did some of these compositional studies on a work table by the kitchen, so I didn't have to schlep everything up and down 3 flights of stairs. And this is a good example of why I set the studio up in a room with only 1 window and then blocked out all the light, because you can see all the light coming straight through the backdrop on this. This was the first take, and we decided it didn't fit into the series because, as you'll see, all the others have a black background. So I needed the painting in the image. I figured I'd have to treat it as an object and not a background. I didn't have a frame nearly big enough, so I found a photo of a gold frame someone was selling on eBay, cleaned it up, removed the background, put the digital version of the painting in it, and then adjusted its perspective to look like it was leaning against the wall, and then painted in shadows digitally to match the lighting. One last detail. The photo on the phone is of myself, my husband, and friends after hiking the North Slope of Cadillac on my 50th birthday. This one was actually the first image I worked on. I got a tentative list of contributors and their probable topics in April, and the essays aren't due till September. But I've learned over the years that the research will take the writers in some interesting directions that they hadn't planned, and it's not always a good idea for me to jump in until their piece is finished. But my part of the journal is due in December, and September to December is not nearly enough time to do things like, make 12 of these images, sleep, and stay married. Fortunately, Alicia Ansted's article was based on an interview she had done with Julia Child years earlier. So I started riffing on a quote from that interview where she asked Julia if Julia likes lobster, which she does. And Julia adds that she's used lobster in all kinds of recipes except one. Quote, "I haven't tried the microwave with it." So obviously I had to include a lobster in a microwave. When I think of Julia Child, I think of her TV show. So I put out a call on social media for an old cathode ray tube like the TV, like the ones we were using back when her show was on the air. I needed to get an image on the TV that would hold still without fluctuations of light during the photo shoot. So my plan was to gut the TV, put an LED light panel inside, print a still from her show on acetate, and mount it inside the glass. And if any of you in the audience are electricians, you're probably cringing. Fortunately, I looked up, quote, "how to disassemble a CRT TV" before I started, because it turns out that a cathode ray tube can hold in lethal electrical charge for decades. So don't do that. Then plan B. My husband helped me find a cable to hook up my laptop to the TV, but I had forgotten the way CRTs had all that banding, which you don't really notice so much when you're watching, but it's super visible in photos. So I moved on to plan C. I searched through episodes for ones with lobsters, and I took screenshots of promising scenes. I printed those on plain copy paper so the light would show through, but all the static and banding wouldn't, and I taped them to the glass. And then I did a ton of work in post-processing to hide all that tape. Then I got copies of Julia Child's first books, borrowed my mom's microwave and my mother-in-law's blender, and I made a few props for this one, like a fake VCR tape for the opening in the front of the TV. At some point, I don't know why, I decided I would include all the ingredients and all of the equipment for all 13 lobster recipes in Mastering the Art of French Cooking and in the French Chef Cookbook, because I am apparently extremely literal and very ambitious. Now, Julia Child is very specific about ingredients. It's never like 3/4 a cup of white wine. It's always a white Burgundy for this recipe and a Grave for that one. And I was not about to spend hundreds of dollars on alcohol. So most of the wine and liquor for this image was borrowed from the bar at Galen's restaurant. Thank you, Galen's. Liquor that I couldn't borrow, I faked. I copied labels from online sources and tweaked them and printed them, glued them onto empty bottles with similar shapes. I chose not to use real lobsters because I needed 13 of them. And this was going to be at least a 4-day shoot, and I couldn't bear to see that much food wasted. So enter Claudia, the most lifelike plastic lobster I could find. I have a group of friends who meets on Fridays for coffee, and I brought the lobster. And I was like, I'm going to be working with this one closely, so it needs a name. And Alice Clare came up with Claudia. So all of the lobsters you see in that finished photo are Claudia. Once the still life set was fully constructed, I photographed her in multiple locations, like this. I've circled the lobster in each of those. And then I spent hours and hours making a composite of those photographs. We don't really have time to go into how that works, but this is what it looks like to make a composite. Each one of those squares on the right, all those black and white squares, each of those is an individual layer that can be adjusted, moved, or removed completely independently of the others. And these are just the ones that fit into the screenshot. There are at least 60 layers all told in this particular image. And this is what it looks like if I turn off the base layer and you just see the lobsters. And when I turn the base layer back on, off. on. And by the time I finished, I had started to think I really should have sprung for another 12 lobsters. There's the finished image. So Rachel Snell's article called Favorite Recipes as a Window into Women's Lives in Early 20th Century Maine analyzed 2 cookbooks. One of them was published in 1929 by the Soamesville chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star. The Eastern Star is an organization that's open to master masons and their female relatives. And by masons, I mean the Masonic order. After reading Rachel's essay, I began with the assumption that these recipes might have been prepared for a ladies' luncheon or a tea party. So what did a local people's tea party look like in Soamesville in 1929? And I mean, when I think 1920s party, I pretty much think Great Gatsby. And that has got to be the wrong vibe for 1929 Soamesville. And like, not just what did people wear, but what would have been on the table? What did place settings look like? Was there tea, lemonade, coffee, sandwiches? And after looking at a lot of historic images, it looks a lot like what we use for parties now. So I started gathering props. Blue Willow seemed like a safe bet. Milk glass cake stands. Most of what you see in that picture was borrowed. And then cakes. There were like 15 cake recipes in the cookbook, so it seemed like we should really have one of those. But what did a cake look like in 1929? Because the cookbooks not only don't have pictures, they don't have a lot of instructions. And oh, look, birthday candles. They're a thing. Good to know. And here, okay, so that's how big a cake might be when it's finished. And it's frosted and there are pipe decorations on it. So kind of like what we do now. Again, okay, I can work with that. So my daughter Tabitha, whose bedroom you may remember was co-opted for this project while she was away at school, and who was at this point sleeping at her grandparents' house because I had taken her bedroom. Anyway, she agreed to help with this project, and we picked 4 recipes from the cookbook: a pie, a cake, the frosting, and some cookies. And I started roughing out what the composition might look like. And I'm in these photos, I'm using those bundt cake pans for stand-in, like stunt cakes. And I used images that I clipped off the internet to test color schemes and dimensions to see how big I wanted things. I settled on blue and yellow with accents in white and black and silver. And then the baking began. We started with Mrs. Fernald's icebox cookies. None of the recipes included the kind of instructions we're used to, like oven temperature or baking time, which makes sense because they were using a wood-fired oven and it didn't work that way. And if we were lucky, they might specify a fast or slow oven, which would give us a hint. But we had to do a lot of research online to figure out anything beyond, like, put all the ingredients in a bowl and mix them together. And then we were like, what does she mean by pack it in a small tin? Like a cookie tin, a tin can? So in the end, we were like, okay, cookies are about this size. And we used parchment paper and rolled them until they were the size that we thought a cookie should be. And then we had a sort of debate and decided she couldn't possibly have meant what it sounds like in there, which is slice and serve the raw dough. But so we, again, went online and found baking instructions for similar cookies. Now, these came out okay. They were edible. They were very bland, not sweet at all. They're a little bit like shortbread, kind of grainy, tasted like butter. It's hard to say if we got it right because we have no idea what they were supposed to taste like. And we did eat them. Again, we don't want to waste things. And if you dunked these in coffee, they were not bad. Next up was Mrs. Blunt's white cake. Now, based on the ingredients, I expected something like a modern cake. But whether we screwed up or whether it's just supposed to be this way, it turned out really dense, kind of dry, very solid, like structurally sound solid. You could build things with it. This was so heavy. And bland doesn't cover it either. This was like not sweet. It was totally neutral, didn't even taste like butter. Total fail. Sorry, Mrs. Lunt. The boiled frosting, on the other hand, was really good. Like, I'm going to be making that again for sure if I ever start cooking again. Sadly, it turned out that neither Tabby nor I have steady enough hands for frosting a cake. I mean, we kind of pulled it together, but I still think this was done, looks like it was done by I don't know, a 2-year-old on a sugar high. I wanted the frosting to match the color of the blue willow china. And so I really mixed that carefully with putting little bits of black into the blue coloring until I got just the right shade. But it turns out that this blue food coloring will stain like anything. You come within 5 feet of the bowl of frosting and you turn blue. So this made the most horrendous mess. And then I am too vain to eat this stuff. But it turns out that really the rest of my family is perfectly willing to walk around with blue lips and teeth. That's how good that frosting was. And I forgot to take pictures while we were making Mrs. Fernald's lemon pie. This one, this one was a keeper. This was so good. The filling turned out somewhere between a curd and a custard with like this tangy lemon flavor. It was nowhere near as sweet or as tart as modern versions. It was so good. And for this one, like with all the others, there's like this assumption that you know the basics already and they don't need to tell you. In this one instance, I am very pleased to say Mrs. Fernald was right. When she says, make a meringue of whites of eggs, sugar, and lemon juice, I know how to do that. I'm actually really good at meringue. This turned out so well. We were really happy with that. Sadly, by the time we started taking pictures, like it took so long to set up the whole still life and put all the food together. The meringue had started to weep by the time that we took these pictures, and by the end of the session, the lemon filling was kind of liquefying, but we ate all of it anyway. So Tabby had to leave for work, so I roped my son Chris into lighting the candles because this kept happening when it was just me. By the time I lit those things, walked back to my camera, checked the focus, I'd get like a shot, and then there would be puddles of wax on top of the cake. So I had to call in help. And there's the finished photo. Okay, this was for an article on foraging. This was a real puzzle to set up because forage ingredients, by definition, they're not things you can buy at the store. And they're not gathered at the same time of year. So there was no way to compose this in advance. I just photographed things as they came into bloom, starting in May, using this lighting arrangement that I had decided on. When that final article was submitted, it included a recipe for lilac syrup. So I chose this lilac photo. And then I did a whole series of other photos with the rest of the ingredients, oranges, lemons, sugar, and water, including the cake plate from the lilac photos to make sure I had the camera and lighting angles lined up. Next was cutting out all the various pieces and building composite photos to test out possible compositions of the elements. Once I had chosen a composition, I had to refine things, like making sure all the shadows lined up and that anything that overlapped was properly trimmed. In this example, the original photo of the lilacs is at top left, and at bottom right is the composite in which I had moved the fallen blossoms closer to the cake stand. So I had to be very careful how things overlapped. Now, here's the thing about this kind of composite work. I doubt very much that anyone would have looked at that image at the top left and said, that does not look right. But logically, there should be reflections in the shiny metal. And at bottom right, you can see the difference where I've added reflections of both flowers and the lemon to the silver. And like I said, I don't think this level of detail is obvious to the casual viewer, but things like this add up. And if shadows are off or reflection are missing, something just feels wrong. And interestingly, this is one of the things that AI images often mess up. If a photo gives you a weird feeling and you're not sure, look at the reflections and look at the shadows. It often will tell you whether it's real or not. One more thing about lighting that I realized while I was editing this particular still life. I had always thought of Dutch lighting as being really dramatic, like high contrast lighting, with everything dissolving into really dark shadows and very bright highlights. But it turns out it's actually very low contrast. It means there's a wide range of light with more gradual changes between shadow and highlight. And adapting a photograph to look dramatic like this is a trick and a half. This is a painting technique. And getting a photo to look like this, I'm going to use this painting to explain because it has a black tablecloth like mine. So if you look closely at the shadows under the teacup and the saucer, they're clearly visible on the black tablecloth. The shadows on the fruit basket feel really deep, but you can still see fruit in the shadow. This is what the lilac photo looks like when it's edited for high contrast and drama. The darks are so deep, the shadows cast by the flowers and the lemon aren't visible against the black tablecloth. And the picture in the background and the flowers on the right side of the table are completely hidden in the shadows. But when I lower that contrast, the shadows become more transparent. They're visible against the black tablecloth, and those hidden objects are visible. And I admit I struggled with this. It's so counterintuitive. It was a trick to capture that delicate balance between drama and clarity. And I have to admit, it's a really good thing I had a hard deadline for this when the journal went to press, because I'd probably still be fussing with this. This one was for an essay called Gifts from Former Shores by Catherine Schmidt, Bonnie Newsom, and Rebecca Colwill. And it included a discussion of oyster shells found in Wabanaki shell mounds. While the other photographs were all composed and photographed in one place, even if not all at the same time, this one was photographed in different cities as well as different times. So in their article, the authors speculated that the smoked and dried oysters brought back home in birch bark containers could be mixed with crushed acorns into a warming winter stew. And that possibility was the genesis of this image. The centerpiece is a contemporary birch bark container made by Barry Dana, an artist, Penobscot culture bearer, and a former Penobscot Nation chief. The lichen and weathering on the bark, which he carefully selected and preserved during the harvest and construction, make it look so much older. The oyster shells there were excavated from a shell mound in the Damariscotta River estuary. And I've deliberately distorted the identifying info on the artifact tag to protect the site. Now, I photographed that partially filled bark container with Bonnie and Catherine's help in the archaeology lab at the anthropology department of University of Maine, Orono, where Bonnie's a professor. So this picture was taken in the basement at the anthropology department. And as you can imagine, raw mollusks, wet seaweed, rotten wood, and fire are not really welcome in a museum. So I recreated the composition in my home studio. I used a wide bowl that had a similar shape and oyster shells I had saved from Thanksgiving dinner, and I ran them through the dishwasher a few times. Then I added rockweed gathered off the bar, decayed birch branches and acorns from the ground at Glen Mary, granite cobbles, pine branches, and I built this kind of stage set around the oyster bowl. I matched the camera angle and lighting as closely as possible to the first photo. I also photographed flames in my wood stove and added those. Like, that piece of bark isn't actually on fire, but you can probably tell I'm ridiculously pleased with how well that illusion works. This part of the image was also kind of complicated. If you remember, the raw oysters on top of the excavated shells and the oak branch leaning over the bark container were photographed in my studio, which meant the shadows that they cast in the studio had to be matched to the older photo. So if you think of these layers as acetate, I laid a transparent copy of the white bowl over the birch bark container and put a blank layer on top of that, traced the shadows with a Photoshop drawing tool, removed the white layer, softened the shadows, and adjusted their density to fit the birch bark. And that's the final image. I can't ask you guys online, but if any of you grew up in Bar Harbor, you probably hung out at Bees when you were at Connors Emerson. I didn't grow up here, but both my husband and my kids raised in the village a generation apart, they have memories of stopping at Bees. They closed in 2024 after about 100 years in business. The Bar Harbor Historical Society received the original glass containers when Bees closed, along with tools and labels and other things, and they allowed me to use those. I photographed some of the paper ephemera and made props from those photos. When I started this project, I asked the Growing Up in Bar Harbor Facebook page, what was your favorite candy at Bees? And oh my God, that conversation went on for a week. Like, people were just chatting back and forth. It was so much fun. And I really wanted to include everyone's favorites. Like, I tried to put every candy that they mentioned into this photograph. And a lot of our childhood candies have been discontinued. So I went back to the internet and found photos of the packaging and made props for those too. There was an awful lot of real candy involved. And I was working in a small room on the top floor of the Historical Society, and it was warm. And the smell of fruit flavoring was so strong when I opened that door, people could smell it all the way down on the second floor. Now, again, thinking about waste, I live on Ledgelawn, so all of the wrapped candies went into our trick-or-treat bowl. This was a few weeks before Halloween. But even so, there was a lot of candy left over. It took the kids and I about 2 weeks to go through all the gumballs, but it didn't take that long for all the rest to disappear. And do we have time for one more, Lisa?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So this was for an article on food pantries on the island. So Tom Reeve had showed me around the Bar Harbor Food Pantry. This is when it was still at the YW. And it took almost an hour out of his day to explain the national organizational structures for food insecurity and how their particular facility works and who they serve. And this is where the project got super fun. Tom showed me a page from the Bar Harbor Food Pantry's 2023 annual report, in which they presented their statistics as if they were filling out a food label, which I thought was completely brilliant. I totally ran with it. The whole still life is based on this image. So the USDA has really precise requirements for the layout of a nutritional label. Like, the font has to be Helvetica Black and Helvetica Regular, and the title can't be smaller than 22 points, and the smallest words can't be less than 6 points, and so on, which is fantastic because all you have to do is follow those rules and your labels look real. Campbell's soup seemed like a pretty classic choice for the first label. I used an older version of their label because the new version has a lot less distinctive detail. I used Photoshop to clean up the original label, and then I adapted and kind of manipulated the text. And I freely admit that I went way overboard with the details on this project, knowing perfectly well that this was not going to show up in the final photo, but I was just having way too much fun to stop. Here, I carefully erased the Campbell's seal, if you can see it in that photo. And I made sure I kept the right color. And then I made a black and white version of the food pantry logo, and I set it in place of the seal. And this is what it looks like to build this label in Photoshop. In this case, there's 24 layers, painting out the original writing and then adding the new stuff, and keeping each element on its own layer for maximum adjustability. So then I printed the faux labels and glued them back on their original containers. Here I'm testing two versions of that nutrition label. One has a white background and one is transparent. And then I just kept going. I made a product for each nonprofit food insecurity organization in the network. And I bought products in a red and blue color palette, and I scanned those labels. And I combed through the various organizations' websites for logos and slogans and data, and then adapted and manipulated the text. And depending on what it's able to find, some of the products have a nutritional label with the organization's statistics. Others just have phrases and data from the websites and reports. And most of that detail isn't visible in the finished image, but you never know how exactly an object will need to be placed. And I, I was really just having way too much fun. So, you know the drill by now. Thumbnail sketches, gather props. I put out 2 social media calls for this image. I needed a child-sized Chrome shopping cart. And I was really surprised at how many of my friends had one of these, and a neon sign, which ended up coming out of the front window of the Town Hill Market. Lily pulled it out for me at closing time on Friday and gave me until Sunday evening to get it back to her. And in tribute to the food pantry's commitment to providing fresh produce for its customers, I made darn sure that my store was also full of fruit and vegetables. And I thought I'd show you one last behind the scenes shot of working on this. This is me trying to get these fiddly little tart things into position without smearing the piped butter all over the black velvet tablecloth. And I have a really weird look on my face because I was trying to make the scene messier. Like it needs to be perfectly messy. Like it can't just be messy. Like it can't be messy involving smeared butter on black velvet. So I had just taken a bite out of the one in my hand, and my daughter decided to take a photo. And so I'm like trying to smile with a mouthful of puff pastry and like wondering if there's butter on the end of my nose. So that's all I have to share with you tonight.
Thank you very much, Jen. If anybody has any questions, I can turn on the microphones or you can turn them on yourself and ask a question. I don't have anything in the Q&A right now. I certainly have some questions for you. First of all, I work at the MDI Historical Society and I edited that edition, and I am definitely going back in looking at those photographs with a fine-tooth comb because I noticed some of the details, but I didn't realize, especially that food pantry one, is there's so many Easter eggs in that. And my other question is, what did you do with the props from that? Was the food pantry were they able to see your finished project?
I sent, I emailed a copy of the photograph to them, and I still have the labels. I
Oh,
mean,
that's
if they
great.
ever want them, they're welcome to them. But again, the data is from 2023, so I don't know it would be useful to them.
Right.
I suppose we could update it.
Yeah. Um, My other question is, if you had to pick one of the recipes that you recreated to serve in a dinner party, what would you choose?
That lemon meringue pie.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so good.
I just took a screenshot of that recipe, by the way.
Well, you have it in your archives there.
I do, yes. Um, I really liked how you substituted the lemon heads box for the lemon. Are there, do you have a sort of a favorite creative modern substitution for the traditional still life object?
That was probably my favorite.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think I managed. I didn't even manage to get a lemon into all of them.
Yeah.
Like some of them, it just felt like I could not figure out any kind of lemon to get into the picnic one.
Yeah.
It was just too much of a stretch.
Um, I think you've answered all my other questions. So one of the images that you haven't didn't show was from the article about the ghost in the bean pot, which was about the trade of with slave states in the Caribbean. And I that image is really powerful, and it made me think about how art can help with processing stories like that.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can pull that up. Um, Okay, can you guys see this?
No. Oh, yes.
Okay. So this is the one you're talking about?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, what was the question?
I'm just curious about it's a very, very striking and disturbing image. And when you read the article, it's perfectly positioned to help sort of visualize that striking, we often think, oh, baked beans, it's a New England tradition, but there was a lot of pain and not so great stories that went along with our ability to get molasses and sugar.
Mhm.
And I just wonder how you feel as an artist and somebody who appreciates art, how art and how you create, how by creating this image, how does that help us process um, difficult subjects, I guess.
Well, Anna's article was very moving. And
Yes.
her point was that a lot of our wonderful New England foodways, like molasses cookies and baked beans, depended on the slave trade, on slave labor on the sugar plantations. And, that's, I don't like thinking about that.
Yeah.
It's very uncomfortable. And I started to feel like our traditions are haunted. Um, and like by the ghost of the people who suffered in making
Yeah.
them. And so when I made this image, I was really thinking of 19th century mourning pictures. There's an urn and a veil wrapped around it. And then I had a really hard time thinking of a way to have both baked beans and slavery in the same image and not trivialize slavery.
Yeah.
And so this was the best I could do.
Yeah.
It was a hard one.
Yeah. Well, does anybody else have any questions? If not, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you will meet us back here on Zoom with Rachel Snell on February 26th, where she will be talking about her Chebacco article about more than just a recipe, about how she was reading about women's life and home life and situation at the time that they were writing these cookbooks and these recipes. So thank you again. I really appreciate you all for spending your evening with us. And we have recorded this and we'll put it on our website and it should be up in about a week for you to share. So thank you very much. Thanks, Jen.